There is a book older than most of the Old Testament, found in more copies at Qumran than Exodus, quoted directly by a New Testament apostle, and banned by name at a church council in 364 CE. Not lost, not ignored, banned. They read it carefully, called a meeting about it, and voted it out of your Bible. That decision has shaped everything you were ever taught about angels, demons, and where evil actually comes from. And most people have never even heard of it. What even is the Book of Enoch? Let me start with the basics because I think a lot of people come to this topic already halfway down a rabbit hole they found at 2 a.m, and I want to back up and actually lay the foundation properly. So, the Book of Enoch. It is not one book. That is the first thing most people get wrong. And honestly, once you understand that, the whole text starts making a lot more sense. What scholars call First Enoch is actually a collection of 5 separate documents, written at different times, by different authors, in different literary styles, that were eventually bound together under the name of one man. Think of it less like a novel and more like a filing cabinet, where someone collected everything they considered important and labeled the whole cabinet with the same name. The 5 sections are the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36, the Book of Parables, chapters 37 through 71, the Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, the Book of Dream Visions, chapters 83 through 90, and the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108. Each section has its own concerns, its own style, its own theological agenda. And scholars have spent a very long time arguing about which parts are oldest. The current consensus, and I say current because Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship moves faster than people realize, places the astronomical book as the oldest material, with some fragments dating to around 300 BCE. The Book of the Watchers, which is what we are going to spend most of our time on today, sits somewhere between 300 and 200 BCE in terms of its composition. Fragment 4, Q201, which is stored at the Israel Museum's Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from the Book of the Watchers. Radiocarbon testing places it at approximately 200 BCE. That fragment is older than every single book of the New Testament. Just want that to land for a moment. The complete text survives in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the only Christian tradition that kept Enoch inside its official biblical canon. Every other church dropped it. The Ethiopians looked at the same text everyone else was looking at, and they made a different call. I think that matters. I think the fact that one tradition kept it and everyone else discarded it is not evidence the Ethiopians were wrong. It is evidence the decision to remove it was political, not theological. But we will get to that. The manuscripts that gave Europe its first real look at the text came to the West in 1773, when a Scottish explorer named James Bruce convinced the Ethiopian church to let him take 3 Ge'ez copies back with him. Bruce gets a lot of credit in the popular telling of this story, and honestly, fair enough. The man traveled to Ethiopia in the 1700s, which was not a casual undertaking. But what gets less attention is that the church had been sitting on complete copies of this text for over 1,000 years before Europe rediscovered it. They did not lose it. They kept it, intentionally, behind stone walls in Axum. Who was Enoch, and why should you care? Here is where we have to talk about the man himself, because the text is inseparable from the figure it is attributed to, and that figure is genuinely strange even by the standards of the Old Testament, which sets a reasonably high bar for strangeness. Enoch appears in Genesis chapter 5, which is one of those chapters that most people skip because it is basically a very long list of who begat whom and how many years everyone lived. And look, I understand the impulse to skip it. It is not exactly a page-turner. But buried in the middle of this genealogy is one of the most quietly remarkable verses in the entire Bible. Genesis 5 verse 24 says this, And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That is it. That is the whole entry. Every other patriarch in that chapter gets the same formula. So-and-so lived this many years, had sons and daughters, and he died. Enoch gets something completely different. He does not die. He simply stops being present on earth because God took him somewhere. The Hebrew word used there is lakash, which means to take or to receive. It is the same word used later for Elijah being taken up in the whirlwind. So from the very beginning, within the canonical text itself, Enoch is flagged as someone who had a relationship with God that functioned differently from everyone around him. He walked with God. He was taken. He did not die in the ordinary sense. And this is the figure the book of Enoch presents as the narrator of everything that follows. Not a prophet issuing warnings from a distance. A man who was physically taken somewhere and shown things, and who then came back and wrote them down. Now, I want to be honest with you about something. When I first started reading the book of Enoch seriously, and by seriously I mean not just the highlight reel that circulates online, but the actual scholarly editions with the footnotes and the textual variants and the parts that do not make good YouTube thumbnails, my first reaction was not awe. My first reaction was genuine confusion. Because the text is dense. It is repetitive. It circles back on itself. It uses terminology that does not translate cleanly from Ge'ez or Aramaic into anything that sounds natural in English. Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford translation remains the standard scholarly edition in English, spent years working through exactly these problems. And his notes are as interesting as the text itself, because he keeps flagging passages where the manuscript traditions diverge, where one copy says one thing and another says something slightly different, where a phrase in Ge'ez carries a secondary meaning that the English translation has to collapse into a single word and loses something in the process. What I came away with, after spending longer with this text than I probably should admit to, is that Enoch is a figure the ancient world took seriously in a way that our inherited tradition has worked hard to make us forget. And I think that forgetting was not accidental. The Watchers. Angels who broke the rules. This is the part everyone comes for, and I get it. The Watchers are the most dramatically compelling element in the entire text, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Chapter 6 is where the core narrative begins. Angels, called the children of heaven, look down at human women and make a decision they were never supposed to make. Their leader, Semjaza, gathers 200 of them on Mount Hermon, a real mountain, a real location in northern Israel and southern Syria, and they swear an oath together. They come down, they take human wives. And what follows is not framed as a simple moral failure. It is a catastrophic breach of the boundary between two orders of being that were never supposed to touch. Chapter 7 describes the children born from these unions as giants. Before you start converting cubits to feet in the comments, the numbers are symbolic. The point is not the height. The point is wrong scale. These beings did not fit the world they were born into, which is itself a theological statement about what happens when categories collapse. But chapter 8 is the part that actually stops me every time I read it. Because chapter 8 lists what the Watchers taught humanity before everything fell apart. Weapons manufacturing, astrology, astronomy, enchantments. And, I always pause here, cosmetics, jewelry, the art of adornment. These are not the tools of monsters. These are the tools of civilization. And the text is making a claim, with a completely straight face, that certain features of human civilization arrived through an unauthorized knowledge transfer from beings who had no business being here in the first place. Dr. George Nicholsberg, whose 2001 Fortress Press commentary remains the definitive scholarly reference on this material, puts it plainly. The Azazel narrative locates the origin of human suffering not in human disobedience, but in a violation from above. The problem did not start with us. According to Enoch, it came to us. the giant problem. Nobody talks about. The Watchers came down, had children with human women. Those children were giants. The giants ate everything, and when the food ran out, they turned on each other and then on humanity. Most discussions of the Book of Enoch stop right there. That is where the drama is most legible, and honestly, it is enough drama for most people. But chapter 15 is where the text does something almost nobody talks about in popular treatments of this material. Chapter 15 describes what happened to the giants after they died. God speaks directly to Enoch and says this: "The giants who were produced from spirit and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth." Evil spirits have gone forth from their bodies. They take no food but nevertheless hunger and thirst and cause offenses. Read that slowly, because what the text is saying is that what we call demons are not fallen angels. They are the disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. The giants died, their bodies were destroyed, but their spirits, being hybrid in nature, half spiritual being and half human, did not go wherever human spirits go. They did not return to the angelic realm either. They got stuck, in between, on earth, looking for bodies to inhabit because they remembered having one. That is not a vague claim. That is a specific origin account for evil spirits with a logic attached to it. They hunger but cannot eat. They were formed from flesh but cannot rest in pure spirit. They do not fit anywhere. And the text treats that displacement, not malice, not rebellion, as the actual source of their destructive behavior. Cosmic homelessness as the engine of evil. That is a more sophisticated theological idea than most people expect from a text written before the Roman Empire existed. And it is sitting in a book the Church voted out in 364 CE. God's response, and what it reveals about divine justice. Chapter 10 is where the divine response arrives, and it is worth reading carefully because the structure of God's response in Enoch reveals something about the theology of the text that I think gets lost when people focus only on the dramatic elements. God sends 4 archangels with specific assignments. He sends Raphael to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. He sends Gabriel to destroy the children of the Watchers by turning them against one another. He sends Michael to bind Semjaza and his companions under the hills of the earth until the day of judgment. And he sends Sarakael, who gets less attention than the others but whose assignment is specifically to the children of the Watchers who sinned in the spirit. What I want to draw your attention to is the differentiation. Different beings receive different sentences. Azazel is bound and buried in the desert, a specific location the text calls Dudael, with rough and jagged rocks placed over him until the day of judgment. Semjaza and the other Watchers are bound under the hills. The giants are destroyed through mutual combat. Their spirits become the disembodied evil spirits of chapter 15. These are not the same sentence applied to different defendants. This is a structured legal response with specific punishments calibrated to the specific nature of each transgression. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the leading authorities on Second Temple Jewish literature, has argued that this differentiated judgment structure in Enoch reflects a sophisticated theological vision of divine justice that influenced later Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thought more deeply than the canonical texts alone can account for. In other words, the categories of judgment that show up in later texts, including New Testament texts, make more sense when you know that Enoch's framework was already circulating and already shaping how people thought about divine accountability. The flood in Enoch is not just a punishment. It is a cleanup operation. God sends the flood specifically to remove the corrupted surface world that the Watchers and their offspring created. But the flood does not touch the imprisoned Watchers because they are already below the surface. It does not eliminate the evil spirits because they are not material. The flood, in Enoch's telling, addresses only one layer of the problem. The deeper layers remain, contained but unresolved, awaiting a final judgment that has not yet arrived. There is something almost frustrating about this account of divine justice, And I mean that in the best possible way, because it does not give you a clean resolution. It gives you a contained situation. The watchers are bound. The worst is over. But they are still there. Their spirits are still active. The damage they caused is still working itself out through history. And God's response, comprehensive as it is explicitly described as temporary. A holding action. Not the end. That is not the kind of God most Sunday morning sermons describe. And I think that is part of why this text made the church nervous. Why was this removed? The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE voted Enoch out of the scriptural canon. And the popular explanation for why that happened usually focuses on the content about the watchers, the angels sleeping with human women, the giants, the violence. Too scandalous, too weird, too hard to explain to a congregation without things going sideways. That explanation is not wrong, but I think it is incomplete. And when you actually read what Jerome and Augustine wrote about Enoch, you find something more specific and more interesting than general discomfort with scandalous content. Jerome, who was assembling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, wrote about Enoch with a dismissiveness that reads, to me, like someone trying not to take something too seriously. He called the text's supernatural geography confused. He called its cosmology incompatible with Mosaic tradition. He did not say it was false. He said it was confused. That is a softer word than false, and it is a telling choice. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, was more direct about the institutional problem. He argued that detailed accounts of angelic sin, divine imprisonment, and the origin of evil spirits should not be in general circulation, because they would lead people to draw their own conclusions about the nature of spiritual reality rather than accepting the conclusions the church offered. He was not saying Enoch was lying. He was saying Enoch was dangerous because he was specific. A specific claim is a testable claim. A testable claim is an autonomous claim. And autonomous theological thinking is, from an institutional perspective, a problem. The Canon 60 of the Council specifically prohibits books that describe the structure of spiritual prisons or provide geography for places of divine punishment. Read that carefully. They were not banning bad theology. They were banning precise theology. Theology that puts things on a map and gives them addresses. What was kept in the canon, and this is not a criticism of the canon, it is just an observation about what the selection process was optimizing for, is theology that requires interpretation. Theology that requires a mediating institution to explain what it means. Vague language about spiritual realities that only trained clergy can properly decode. Enoch does not do that. Enoch says Azazel is bound under the desert in a place called Dudael, with rocks over him until the judgment day. That is not a statement that requires a bishop to explain. You can read it yourself and form a view. I think the Book of Enoch was removed not because it was considered false, but because it was considered unauthorized. It gave ordinary readers too much specific information about how the supernatural world was actually organized, and it gave them that information in a way that bypassed the institutional structures that were supposed to control access to that kind of knowledge. Jerome read it. Augustine read it. The council members at Laodicea read it. None of them said it was made up. They said it was too much. That is a very different verdict, and I think it deserves to be treated as one. What the New Testament authors knew. Here is the thing that I cannot get past when I sit with this material, and I have sat with it long enough now that it has genuinely changed how I read certain parts of the New Testament. The letter of Jude, which is a canonical New Testament book that most people have not read because it is short and tucked near the back, directly quotes the Book of Enoch. Not alludes to, not echoes. Quotes. Jude verse 14 and 15 says, "And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, The Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all. That is from Enoch chapter 1 verse 9. Word for word, in a book that is in your Bible, quoting a book that is not in your Bible. And the author of Jude introduces Enoch by name and calls him a prophet, not a fiction writer, not a confused ancient, a prophet. The second letter of Peter, chapter 2, verse 4, refers to angels who sinned being cast into Tartarus, the Greek word for the deep abyss, where they are reserved for judgment. That is the watcher imprisonment narrative from Enoch chapter 10. Peter does not cite Enoch by name, but he is describing a scenario that does not exist in the canonical Old Testament. The only place you find that scenario fully developed is in Enoch. Paul's letter to the Corinthians contains a passage in chapter 11, verse 10, that has baffled interpreters for centuries. Paul writes that women should cover their heads in worship because of the angels. Because of the angels. Scholars have been explaining that verse away since roughly the 2nd century. But if you know that Enoch's watcher narrative was part of the active theological conversation Paul was participating in, the verse stops being baffling. It becomes a reference that assumes the reader already knows about angels being drawn to human women in problematic ways. Paul is not being cryptic. He is being brief, the way you are brief when you are referencing something your audience already understands. Dr. James Vanderkam, in multiple publications including his 2001 commentary and his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, has written that the Enochic tradition was almost certainly part of the background knowledge that shaped how the earliest Christians understood sin, judgment, spiritual beings, and the origin of evil. What we have in the New Testament is not a clean break from Enoch. It is a selective inheritance from Enoch. Some parts were kept. Some parts were quietly set aside. Some parts were absorbed into the new framework without attribution. And then, about 3 centuries after the New Testament was written, the Council of Laodicea drew a line and said, from this point forward, Enoch is not on the list. The inheritance became invisible, the source was classified. And for 17 centuries, most of the Western world read a New Testament that quotes a book it officially does not recognize, without ever knowing that is what they were reading. That is extraordinary. And I think it is important. Not because it undermines the New Testament, it does not, but because it complicates the idea that the canon we inherited was a simple, clean, divinely obvious selection, rather than a historically contingent, politically influenced, institutionally managed process that made some genuinely strange decisions along the way. My personal take. All right. I want to step back from the scholarship for a moment and just tell you where I actually land on this, because I think you deserve to know what the person presenting this material actually thinks, rather than just getting a series of interesting facts delivered in a tone of careful neutrality. I am not here to tell you the Book of Enoch should be in your Bible. That is not my call, and it is not really the interesting question anyway. The interesting question, at least to me, is what the existence of this text and the history of what was done to it tells us about how the documents we do consider authoritative came to be in the positions they occupy. And what it tells me is this: the canon was a process. It was a long, contested, politically shaped, theologically argued process conducted by human beings who had institutional interests as well as theological convictions, and who made decisions that reflected both. That does not make the canon invalid. It makes it human, which is, depending on your theology, entirely compatible with it also being divinely guided. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, but they do mean that the canon's edges are interesting in a way the center often is not. The Book of Enoch sits right at the edge. It was known. It was used. It was quoted. It was copied obsessively, 11 times at Qumran alone, more copies than Exodus, if you want a number that really makes you stop and think. And then it was voted off the island, to use a phrase Enoch himself would definitely not have understood, by a council meeting in 364 CE, and the whole Western tradition mostly forgot it existed for 17 centuries. What I keep coming back to, and I do not have a clean answer for this, is the question of what we lost when we lost access to this framework. Not because I think Enoch is literally describing a physical prison under the ocean, or a moon with operational chambers. I think those sections of the text are doing something more complex than simple reportage. But because the framework Enoch offers for thinking about the origin of evil, the nature of spiritual beings, the structure of divine justice, the relationship between the human world and other orders of being, is genuinely more sophisticated than what replaced it in popular Christian consciousness. A vague devil, a vague hell. Good people go up, bad people go down. That is not theology. That is a bedtime story. Enoch gives you something harder to sit with. It gives you a world where the problem is structural, where evil has an origin and a logic, where divine justice is differentiated and specific, where the boundaries between categories of being are real and their violation has consequences that unfold across cosmic time. That is a more serious account of the world than most people have been offered. And it was sitting in a cedar box in Ethiopia the whole time, waiting for someone to ask why the church found it necessary to hold a meeting about it. I think that question is worth asking. I think the answer is more interesting than either the skeptics or the true believers usually admit. And I think we are just getting started. So, Episode 1. We have covered the basic structure of what the Book of Enoch actually is, the 5 sections, the manuscript traditions, the Qumran fragments. We have talked about Enoch the man, the Genesis cameo, the walking with God detail, the being taken without dying. We have walked through the Watcher narrative, what they did, what they taught, what their children became, and what those children became after they died. We have looked at God's response in chapter 10, and what its differentiated structure tells us about the theology of the text. We have looked at why the Council of Laodicea removed it, and what Jerome and Augustine actually said, as opposed to what people assumed they said. And we have looked at what the New Testament authors clearly knew and just as clearly chose not to fully cite. That is a lot of ground. And we have not touched the Book of Parables, which is where the Son of Man language shows up in Enoch decades before it appears in the Gospels, a detail with implications I genuinely do not know what to do with yet. We have not touched the astronomical book and what it actually says about the structure of the heavens. We have not touched chapter 22 and the 4 hollows, the most detailed account of the afterlife in all of Second Temple Jewish literature, which is different enough from anything the Western Church teaches that I need a full episode to do it justice. We have not touched the dream visions in chapters 83 through 90, which contain an allegorical history of Israel from Adam to the Maccabees that reads like the most ambitious piece of symbolic storytelling you will find in any ancient text. And we have not touched the Epistle of Enoch, which closes the whole collection with material that some scholars believe was circulating independently before it was attached to the rest. There is a lot left. And I am not going anywhere. If this kind of material is what you came here for, the texts that were removed, the decisions that shaped what you were allowed to read, the questions that the official story leaves unanswered, then stay close. Because we are going to go through all of it, carefully, with the scholarship in one hand and, if I am being honest, a fairly strong cup of coffee in the other. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Bible in 364 CE. The manuscripts have been sitting in Axum for over 1,000 years. The fragments are under glass in Jerusalem. And the text, the actual words, the Aramaic and the Ge'ez, the careful, precise, strange, ancient language of a man who walked with God and was taken somewhere and came back with things to say, that text has not changed. It has been waiting. And now you know it exists. Episode 2 is coming. We are going into the 4 hollows. Bring your questions.